Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to this session on teaching in the age of the algorithm. It deals with one of the pressing problems for all of us who are teaching at whatever level. How do we do this in this age of these new technologies? I'm going to moderate for you today. My name is Paul Schurz, and I'm the Our Lady of Guadalupe Professor of Theology here at Notre Dame and a Fellow of the De Nicola Center. So we have a great group of speakers today. Our first speaker will be talking about hope, robots, and the Catholic tradition. Heather Foucault-Cam is the program director for the Science and Religion Initiative at the McGrath Institute for Church Life, where she develops pedagogical programming and delivers presentations on bioethics, technology, and chemistry. A former high school teacher and curriculum designer, she has a bachelor's and master's of science in the field of chemistry, an MA in theology from Notre Dame, where she's continuing to work on her PhD in moral theology. Her scholarly work focuses on the social implications of emerging technologies with a particular interest in AI. She's a member of the AI Research Group for the Dicastery for Culture and Education. She's a scholar associate of the Society of Catholic Scientists and a lay Dominican of the province of St. Albert the Great. Our second speaker will be Richard Kim, who will be talking on reclaiming the nature of education in the age of AI. He is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Loyola University Chicago. His research focuses on ethics, moral psychology, and East Asian philosophy, with particular interest in the nature of well-being and virtue. He's the author of Confucianism and the Philosophy of Well-Being, and is currently working on a book on ritual and human flourishing in classical Confucian thought. Our third speaker will be AI education. Our third speaker will be Taylor Nutter, who will be talking about AI education and the return to the heart in a liquid world. He is a core teaching fellow at Mount St. Mary's University, where he teaches both theology and philosophy. He graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a PhD in systematic theology. He's also a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Culture and Education's AI Research Group, where he's currently part of the group that's writing the book Education, AI, and Integral Human Development. He has a chapter on AI forthcoming called AI Neocolonialism, A History of the Computational Theory of Mind in Globalization and the New World Order, which will be coming out from Marquette University Press. So with that, we'll start with Heather Foucault-Cam.
Friends, can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Good morning. We read in the Gospel of Matthew that, quote, "Every scribe who has been instructed in the kingdom of heaven is like the head of a household who brings from his storeroom both the new and the old." And if my comments are entitled Hope, Robots, and the Catholic Intellectual Tradition, why begin here? I would propose two reasons: the identity of the scribe and what, precisely, the scribe is doing. First, the scribe, which we can reasonably equate to teacher. Notice how they are likened to the head of a household. Such a role imparts to the educator, and education more generally, something more than the dispensing of information, but rather bestows on them a duty of caring for, and we're going to hold on to this through the talk. Second, the scribe brings forth something from their storeroom, which we know in that time that the scripture was written is a place used to keep something valuable. Moreover, what is being brought forth is both new and old. Knowledge, specifically knowledge of the kingdom of heaven here. Notice the language, both and, as opposed to either the past or the present, either the new or the old. This makes this parable, friends, a powerful commentary not only on the relationship between elements of knowledge, but it sets the tone for how we understand tradition as something received, not something stale that we study, but something very much alive. What is the connection between this parable and how to teach in the age of the algorithm? For me, it's everything. While there is no denying that AI is a new-ish tool, one that has both the power to disrupt many aspects of human life and lead to tangible improvements in human flourishing, AI cannot and must not be thought of as apart from the arc of technological advancement. We would be foolish scribes indeed if we did not look into the storeroom of human history for some perspective on a response to the challenges that technology poses to human life. As a former high school teacher of 10 years, an instructor of space ethics here at Notre Dame, we can talk about that later, the particular challenge that I would like to consider is the constituents of the truth, right? I'm going to aim small. By truth, I do not mean the certain truth that the Toronto Blue Jays should have won the World Series. Sorry, I'm Canadian by birth. By truth, I do, by truth, I do, by truth, I do not mean pieces of information, but knowledge as a unified whole, oriented to the attainment of wisdom, through which Thomas says, and I quote, "We attain to the sonship of God." The concern that I would like to trace is the disruption AI poses to this unity of knowledge, a reality that is becoming exponentially more problematic as the access to information becomes more seamless and as the language or algorithm that AI uses becomes more sophisticated. And in some, oh, it's listening to me right now. In some respects, humanity has been here before, a time of technological advancement, asking questions about the unity of knowledge and the implications in education. To this end, St. John Henry Newman has a great deal to add to our line of inquiry. His writing on universal knowledge and the purpose of the university, which we'll transpose for education generally, are the basis for his and our response to the meta question that is core to my paper. How should we engage with technology in the domain of education? As for the robots, you will allow me that rhetorical tool for the moment, because our current instantiations of AI, most of the time, present themselves in our phones and as the constantly helpful assistant that chimes in at just the right moment in our house. Just saying. However, it is not inconceivable that these ethereal tools will eventually start to look more like us, perhaps function in our place. That we are not at that point yet presents us with an incredible opportunity now. There is no more fruitful place for a discussion such as this than in classrooms of any type. Classrooms called, and I quote, to be present as great laboratories of hope at this crossroads of history, where we can engage with wisdom and creativity in careful research on artificial intelligence. What then does it mean to encounter AI in this way? Hope, wisdom, creativity. We can all agree that this includes, but goes beyond conversations about assessment and acceptable use policies. Rather, the question seems to be what it means to learn and to know. Where AI is concerned, the near infinite access to information tempts us to equate access to our questions' answers with mastery. Moreover, this quick question-answer relationship is not fertile ground for the cultivation of the patience and perspective needed to see knowledge of a thing in light of a larger whole. There is a trend brewing in some sections of the public square where the source and summit of what it means to research and to create is increasingly linked only to what can be quickly provided. St. John Henry Newman enters our discussion here. While AI, I would propose, can provide pieces, he reminds us of the essential nature of those pieces to the larger whole. Bridging that gap, pieces that we receive in relation to this larger whole, is the action of what I would propose education, and specifically Catholic education. Moreover, this is a bulwark against the AI-induced temptation to equate more information with the fullness of knowledge. The attainment of that knowledge, Newman reminds, involves an active integration that is frequently misunderstood. On the relationship between faith and reason, an area which I work, an example of two pieces thought to defy integration, Newman writes, theology and science, whether in their ideas or again in their fields, on the whole, are incommunicable, incapable of collision, and needing at most to be connected, never reconciled, end quote. At first, it is jarring, especially for me, to see that connection is at most permissible. Reconciliation is not to be considered. And yet, this is consistent with an understanding of ways of knowing that are distinct from each other. Moreover, and I can lob this around with y'all after, the instant we leave reconciliation on the table, we imply that conflict can be possible. But there's a catch here, right? Apparent conflicts, as opposed to true conflicts, incommensurability. Apparent conflicts are part and parcel of what we need to adjudicate when we integrate. Where the intellectual project goes off the rails, for me at least, is when we equate these instances of apparent conflicts as pointing to an inherent and irreconcilable incompatibility. If we, the scribes of this age, pull from the storehouse only what is new, Then, we stand utterly incapable of crafting a response to instances where pieces of information seem to be antithetical to each other. If we look again back into the tradition for some perspective, Newman offers us the following. I'm sure many of us have heard this. Truth often seems to contradict truth, and we must be patient with such appearances. It is the very immensity of the system of things, the human record of which we have in our charge, that suggests that contraries and mysteries may be simply the consequences of what are necessarily defective comprehension, end quote. Notice the use of the terms patience, immensity of the system, defective comprehension. Where AI is concerned, the immensity of the system under consideration and at our fingertips is near infinite. I can ask Dr. Google, we all know this, a question right now, right? The instantaneous nature of the response hardly lends itself to patience, caution, and attentiveness, necessary requisites to seeing information in light of the larger whole. Therefore, an important element in need of representation in the age of the algorithm remains an investment of time to query, to find, to synthesize, or to return to the drawing board. Because the end of this process requires the most patience of all, as Newman counsels that what I would urge upon everyone is a great and firm belief in the sovereignty of truth. Error may flourish for a time, but truth will prevail. The only effect of error, ultimately, is to promote truth, end quote. Newman's clear that for knowledge to advance, there is a synthesis that occurs, old and new, error and correction, pieces and whole, which requires an investment in time, which draws on our three previous conditions, patience, caution, attentiveness. While there is no denying the incredible value that AI brings to this process, it cannot be the source and summit of what it means to facilitate the prevailing of truth. That is 100% the act of a human person. Newman's previous counsel, patience, caution, discernment, is irreducible to an algorithm, is an outpouring of reason, and remains forever in the domain of what it means to be human. Universal knowledge, which is facilitated by the prevailing of truth, is not at the exclusion of knowing and investigating. Rather, what we need to promote is a paradigm where knowledge in any field is seen to be, one, not apart from its context, and two, that same knowledge does not become the sole means by which we know the world. Now, the case for context, parts in relation to whole, I hope has been made. The case for knowledge of a field not becoming the only lens to which it means to know, this we will now consider because there are implications for how we need to educate, especially now. Returning to Newman, a concern of his was the equating of knowledge with professional skill only. For us, access to infinite information feeding the development of even more hyper-specialization. In the opening preface of the university, he writes about the idea of a university that is a place of teaching universal knowledge. Brilliant. This implies that his object is, on the one hand, intellectual, not moral. And on the other hand, it is the diffusion and extension of knowledge rather than its advancement. On the one hand, we stand reassured that the university is a place of universal knowledge. However, Newman's assertion that the object of the university is intellectual, not moral, bears some considering here. I would offer that he may mean not an education without any thought of the moral, but that the first step towards a deliberate desire for wisdom, right, this idea of the prevailing of truth, must be, in his terms, a liberal education, which points the students to a broader cultivation or synthesis of a life of faith. The opening sentence of the preface still poses a problem for our understanding of the university, because it seems to be limiting, right? Specifically, the latter half of the preface's opening. It is the diffusion and extension of knowledge rather than its advancement. And in my notes, that's italicized, underlined, and bolded. Now, Newman's context here is important, right? So, to take him apart from when he was writing is an issue. Educationally in Ireland, all right, they were at a reasonably low ebb in time with the potato famine. And I think it's reasonable to at least suggest that some of the people that he encountered were more concerned with aspects of subsistence than this higher ideal of education. And this perhaps we could toss around in the Q&A. Thus, I would concede that when Jaroslav Pelikan re-examined Newman's idea of the university, he suggested a revision of this opening sentence to include advancing knowledge through research and diffusing knowledge and publication. Now, considering that advancing knowledge through research and the relating of this to the training of professionals was added by Pelikan as kind of a representation of the idea in our time, this is brilliant. However, what Pelican misses is that the educational experience should not be seen as a training for a given profession only. And I think this is facilitated the more we become subsumed by the digital era. However, what Pelican, and this is increasingly seen, my apologies, in our world, even amongst those as young as grade school, this idea that we're going to train you for an end. What is the missing piece? What does education need to do, especially now, with the threat of hyper-specialization? To answer this, I'm going to jump out of the idea into a homily he gave Newman on the Feast of St. Monica, where he preaches that the object of a university, and you will allow me to kind of apply that to education more generally, is to do the following. To reunite things which were in the beginning joined together by God and have been put asunder by man. Some persons will say that I am thinking of confining, distorting, and stunting the growth of the intellect by ecclesiastical supervision. I have no such thought. I wish the intellect to range with the utmost freedom. What it means to educate, especially in the Catholic intellectual tradition, what needs to be protected in a world where knowledge is increasingly being reduced to pieces of information is outlined, for me at least, right there. Education must first and foremost be about supporting the intellect of the student to range with that freedom, to ask, to test, and to synthesize. The tradition from which I argue, from which this university operates, is one of directed, not restricted inquiry. This directedness is the framework we have been building to thus far in this paper, at least as I understand it. The license to ask all possible questions and using all possible means to answer them, including AI, alongside the consolation of knowing that even the most apparently disparate fields have a relationship to each other that exceeds mere utility. Is that the flashing of my 2 minutes? No. Okay, cool. All right. As my time with you draws to a close for real, we have, from the position of the treasures of the past, looked at the present for an answer to what is at stake when we teach in the age of the algorithm. Where the riches of the present are concerned, the document Antiquae Nova gives to this discussion some contemporary touch points on what is to be done with the latest digital technologies in relation to education. Two corollaries to Newman's position, as I have articulated it, include the following: that the usage of AI in the classroom should assist in the formation of critical thinking skills, and two, that if not carefully considered, AI can narrow what it means to teach. Firstly, AI-mediated software and applications claim to support critical thinking and research skills, and they can. I experienced this as a high school teacher. However, the caution remains that instead of training young people how to amass information and generate quick responses, what we should do, and we've made this point, right, is encourage the responsible use of freedom to face the issues of AI with good sense and intelligence. If education is seen as merely the acquisition of data points, there is precious little that would protest against the eclipse of patience and caution that Newman speaks of earlier. But hopefully we have built up the case that the tradition from which we all operate locates education within something far richer. Education being brought into contact with the world as we seek to understand the truth is fundamentally an integrative act. Because whom we are educating, our second consideration, is not an organic computer. We all know this. We are not training an algorithm, we are forming a human being. On what this looks like in the age of the algorithm, we are cautioned that, and I quote, the extensive use of AI in education could lead to students' increased reliance on technology, eroding their ability to perform some skills independently, end quote. From the cradle of pre-K to the crucible of the university, there remains a responsibility to educate both for the good of the society, form the individual, for where they live now, and for their final end. We conclude, friends, by returning to a charge I mentioned at the beginning, right? For Catholic universities, schools, and parishes to be present as great laboratories of hope at this crossroads of history. It has been my goal in looking into the past at Newman, in his perspective on education, to construct a framework for how the tradition supports elements of a response to what it means to teach in the age of the algorithm. A very real problem for the student in the age of the algorithm remains what it means to learn. In a world where the vastness of human knowledge is at our fingertips, the living tradition from which we all draw serves as a caution that we are called beyond the task of data accumulation and toward the quest for something integrated and directed, a wisdom that perceives the pieces in light of the whole. And it is here that I end, friends, in hope. Because while a significant proportion of my paper has been caution, the expanding corpus of support in favor of the kind of education I've outlined, the papers that you will see here, is very encouraging. And to this end, on the 60th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Catholic Education, Leo XIV wrote, "Our attitude towards technology can never be hostile, because progress is part of God's plan. In my case, he knows no algorithm can ever substitute what makes education human. May we, in a similar manner to the scribe in Matthew and the wisdom of Newman, heed Leo's counsel as we pull from the storeroom the two streams of living tradition and do our part to rise to the challenge that is to educating in the age of the algorithm." Thank you.
All right, it's really good to be here. I think the last time I gave a talk for this conference, I was a graduate student. So this is maybe 7, 8 years ago, or no, it's more like 12 years ago. It's not good. And it used to be called the Ethics and Culture Center. And it was founded by my old advisor, David Solomon, who directed my dissertation. And it was always my favorite conference because people were always extremely nice. You had this broad range of talks, and yeah, it was. I loved going every year. I always thought Heather was like a really nice person, and I just found out why. Because she's Canadian. Canadians. Everyone knows Canadians are the nicest people on earth. Yeah. Okay. So. Oh, is this hooked up? Okay. Sorry. I do have a PowerPoint slide. Okay. Oh, so it's good. All right. Okay, so this talk is called Reclaiming the Nature of Education in the Age of AI. Okay, so I listen to too many podcasts, like probably some of you, and some of them are good, some of them more disreputable. I'm not going to mention them. But one I listen to is this Ezra Klein podcast. I don't necessarily agree with everything, but he seems very thoughtful and articulate. And he had this one podcast episode on education and AI. And at one point, he talks about how he has these small children at home, like 2 and 4 years old. I have 2 kids around that age myself. And he said, AI is very disturbing. He doesn't quite know what's going to happen. And at one point, he said something like, maybe we should reconceive of education. And he started talking about how maybe we should get rid of AI and phones and go back to classical great works. And that really struck me because I thought there's a sense in which, no, that's not reconceiving. Maybe that just is the nature of education. So maybe the idea is we should recover that. And so this paper or presentation is kind of an exploration of that idea. Okay, so I just want to start with some couple of worries we all have. I mean, even before AI, a lot of teachers, a lot of professors. By the way, when I talk about education, I really have in mind university education because that's where I teach. Already there's all kinds of difficulties, right? There's a high cost of education, which people talk about rightly. There's more and more distrust. There's some alarming data about that. There's a demographic cliff, fewer high school students graduating, and so necessarily there's going to be probably fewer students going to college. And of course, there's this question of if AI is going to replace jobs, and people are very worried about that. It's not entirely clear, I think, at this point. The causality, if you study philosophy, causality is very tough to establish. But maybe there's some correlation, so at least it's possible that as AI gets better, maybe it's able to do more and more tasks. I guess we'll see. So these are some worries we already have. Here's a diagnosis I want to make, which is, so the threats of AI along some of these lines is really about the current conception, widespread conception of education, which has to do with skill promotion, credentialism, and content delivery. And so the problem is not AI, it's the modern way of understanding of education. And the remedy that I want to propose is that, well, we should return to this classical conception of education rooted in ancient thought. And by ancient thought here, I have in mind both some ancient Greek thought, but also, turns out, some classical Confucian ideas. They had a view of what learning was. They were very immersed in study. They even had schools. And I think there's some overlap there that's very interesting. Bless you. Okay, so I want to begin with this instrumentalizing mindset that you'll find across different philosophers. Certainly, Alistair McIntyre comes to mind. But there's a way in which the way we think of everything is instrumentalized. We do A for the sake of B, which is for the sake of C. And we're not appreciating the intrinsic goods. Those things are just worthwhile in and of themselves. And so one kind of reason for this is, you might say, liberal individualism, which claims that we should remain neutral regarding values and ends. And so on this view, we can't really call into question or critique ultimate values or ends. Those are just, your individual preference or choice. What we can do is we can talk about means-end reasoning. So those are just a kind of instrumental rationality. There's a kind of bureaucratic rationality that pervades modern life, I think. It focuses on procedures, technical efficiency, again, means-end reasoning. And then you might also think, modern capitalism also tends to focus on maximization of profit and capital from a value-neutral perspective. I think these are really large, complex things here that I don't have enough time to get into. But I think they all kind of come together to sort of push us toward an instrumentalizing mindset. And here, again, I think really important work here is After Virtue of Alistair McIntyre. He has, in chapter 3, these 3 characters he talks about, the aesthete, the therapist, the bureaucratic manager. And these characters are kind of representations of the contemporary, what he calls emotivist culture that we live in. So emotivism is this meta-ethical doctrine that says that moral judgments or expressions of moral approval or disapproval are simply expressions of feelings, right? So the classical way of thinking about this is when you say adultery is wrong, all you're really doing is saying adultery, boo, like, you're just expressing this negative feeling. It doesn't mean you're thinking it's factually like, it's the wrong view because, values are not facts. But that's the kind of emotivism. And he thinks that emotivism is sort of accepted broadly in culture, and we live in a culture where we act as if emotivism is true. We act as if we can't really call into question values and ends, and all we're doing is we're just expressing our disapproval, approval, and so we just get into kind of these interminable disagreements, and right, that's kind of classic McIntyre. And so, and so all this stuff, I think, also leads to education conceived as just merely techne or skill. So students become customers and future workers. Knowledge is just more capital. Okay, so this is kind of my sketch of how kind of education has been reconceived. But of course, this isn't the classical model. So if you go back to Plato's Republic, book 7, where he's talking about the allegory of the cave, there he gives this striking picture of what education is. Whenever I teach this to students, I think they're a little puzzled because it just seems so, for them, many of them, unintuitive. But here's what Plato says. Okay, he says, education isn't what some people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. Education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. It isn't the craft of putting sight into soul. Education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it, it's cut off. Oh, okay, needs to look, I think, and it tries to redirect it appropriately. Okay, so education isn't about pouring knowledge into the empty minds of students. He says it's about turning their gaze and redirecting their focus, and which sounds kind of weird. And in fact, it's so strange to a lot of my students that when I ask them this question on the midterm, they just keep getting it wrong. I say, because I have this true or false question, I say, Plato believed that education is about gaining knowledge. True or false? And they all say true. And I'm like, but no, we read this thing, and I told you, he doesn't think that's what knowledge is. I mean, maybe that's a part of the process. I mean, there's something, right, to it, but but it's about this redirecting of the soul. And you might think, but how could education as a whole be that? I actually think Plato thought that there was something much more weighty and challenging about redirecting your sight toward the true and the good and the beautiful. I think he thought it was a lifelong process. Our gaze, our focus can shift easily. You also need to cultivate good habits of character. You need to be well-formed in order to really have your eye on truth and goodness. And so I think he thought that's actually a very difficult process. And so he thought there was a lot more there. So true education for him really shapes desire and teaches us to love and pursue truth and goodness. It's a kind of a process of molding, right? It's a formative process. You become changed, you become reshaped in the process of education. It's not stuff going into your mind. It's your entire sort of vision of the world. It's your values that become reshaped in this light of the true and the good. Okay, so that's Plato's view. Now, this is probably less familiar to a lot of you, but so I study a lot of Confucianism. So Confucianism is this 2,500-year-old tradition. And what's interesting is these classical Confucians like, Kongzi, so he's Confucius, or Mencius, who's also a very famous Confucian, they lived right around that time of Plato. So Plato lived 427 to 347 BC, around there. And then, and so Mencius and these classical Confucians were living halfway around the world, totally independently, coming up with these ideas about what it is to live a good life, to cultivate the self, what education is. But they have some overlaps that I find to be quite striking. So there's this idea of shui, this is this Chinese character, this is learning in Confucianism. And so there's a lot of different passages here, and I can't sort of unpack them all, but there's this famous passage in the Analects. So the Analects is the text attributed to the teachings of Confucius. And the master said, so master here is Confucius, he said, in ancient times, scholars learned for its own sake. These days, they learn for the sake of others. So there's actually a lot of other passages just like this where he keeps harping on this idea that everybody just is thinking about their reputation, their social status, and they're learning to impress people. But he keeps saying in this passage and elsewhere that learning is for its own sake. It's first of all, for your own good. It's part of the good human life. Now, the second and third passage here is from Zhu Xi. Zhu Xi is, you probably, or many of you probably never have heard of him. He's maybe, he's one of the top four most important Confucians. He lived around the 12th century. And he kind of synthesized some of the metaphysics and the ethics behind Confucianism. But he was a follower of Confucius, and he actually draws on this passage that I just read from the Analects. Zhu Xi said, the problem is that students don't work for their own sake. As a result, they are not well-versed in moral pattern principle, but intimately familiar with idle matters. Yeah, so I wonder if that's like me with the podcast. Is that the idle matters? Okay. But he's also bemoaning the fact that people aren't really studying the important works, the classics, and immersing themselves. They're engaged in trivia. I suppose there was gossip, right? Back in those days too, people were talking about what that neighbor did, and so on. I mean, they didn't have like TikTok, but they still, they walked around and probably gossiped. But what's really important, according to Zhu Xi, is, again, learning for your own sake. And moral pattern principle, that's Li, I can't get into that. He thought that there's ultimately like a universal principle that's in all things. Some people, like Father Dominic Rooney, thinks of it as kind of Aristotelian form, although that's a little bit controversial, but there's really interesting metaphysics there. Now, the third and last passage here is, Zhu Xi says, broad learning refers to the pattern principle of heaven and earth and the myriad things, and to the method of cultivating oneself and governing others. So cultivating yourself is part of learning. So Zhu Xi would have said, part of the whole process of learning is becoming a good, virtuous human being. And in fact, I think the Confucians as a whole would have said, if you pointed out someone who's extremely smart, really, intellectually accomplished, but was really kind of a vicious, petty, cruel human being, the Confucians would have never have said, that's a learned person. Because the primacy was on self-cultivation. That just runs through the Confucian tradition. So again, for the Confucians, learning requires moral cultivation. Okay. How much more time do we have? Okay, 30, okay. Okay, good. So let me just go to the classical model of education. So just to kind of recap, kind of drawing on both those traditions, both in Plato and the Confucians. Okay, if we adopt this, I think, this classical conception of education as intellectual and moral self-cultivation, I don't think AI is no longer a fundamental threat, no matter how good it becomes, even if it reaches what they say, artificial general intelligence, and everyone keeps saying, oh, we don't have a definition, blah, blah, blah. But anyways, even if it reaches that, or artificial super intelligence, sometimes people talk about, we still need education in this sense, this classical model, because education is part of living well. It's not preparation for employment. It's not just you're looking to finally, to get some job that you really want. I mean, that's totally understandable, by the way, of course. We all want good jobs. My parents are immigrants, and that's all they kept saying to me. And but on this classical view, which you find even in Confucianism, education, learning, is a constituent of human flourishing. It's inherently worthwhile. And in fact, yesterday, this is a true story. So my 11-year-old daughter is studying some math, and she's like, why am I learning this? Like, when am I going to use it? And I said to her, well, I don't know when you'll exactly use this, but just the learning itself is good, right? Like, God gave you a mind, and to develop it is a good thing, don't you think? And I don't know if she bought it, but I don't know. I'll ask her later. But she finished her homework. Okay. But maybe just for instrumental reasons. Okay. Okay, and then the second part, self-cultivation happens through, I think, traditions and rituals. So I didn't have time to get into rituals, which is really important, crucial part of Confucianism. But I also think is part of even the Platonic, even the ancient Greek model. But it happens in a social tradition, within a social context, learning from others. And I don't think AI can really replace that ever. I mean, I don't know, maybe if you get to Blade Runner level, I don't know. I'm not sure what to make of that. But okay, but no, we want to learn from humans. Okay, now, when I was writing or thinking through this presentation, and philosophers, we always think about what's the objections, that someone will raise, because they always do. And I think one kind of objection I did think about is, but isn't this a kind of Pollyannish, right, overly rosy view of education? I mean, there's all these challenges about, how to, what education looks like now. And so there's bunch of challenges here I listed. So the classical model, you might think, makes sense in a more coherent, smaller society with shared conceptions of the good. This is one of McIntyre's worry. Again, universities are super expensive now. People are going to wonder, wait, so what's the point of, spending $200,000? It's to redirect my son's gaze toward the good. I mean, that's not, maybe that is enough. Okay. So there's a self-image of universities already now, right? How do university administrators think of the university? Well, it's a part of the market system, right? There's ranking, there's employability, there's branding. And finally, there's temptations everywhere. There's temptations to be caught up in the flashy external goods, right? And they're powerful. That, I think, has always been around. Plato knew it. Confucius knew it. We're attracted by shiny objects and so on, the external goods. Okay. Now, so I actually don't know. I don't know how much we can implement this whole view. I think there's some hope, and that's what I'll end on. So grounds for hope. Okay. Because hope is good. And AI development may lead to greater valuing, I think, of uniquely human capacities. I actually was wondering, when Ezra Klein was making that point, he was wondering if, with AI, if it gets really good at technical stuff, what it can't quite do is get the judgment, the wisdom, ethical discernment, the social intelligence. So maybe actually, in a weird way, AI might kind of make us think about education differently. And finally, I think young people still want this, and they have a hunger for it, and it's a perennial desire. They want spiritual depth, moral depth, and so I think there's still hope in that regard. My time is done. They're pulling me. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for packing this room. In high school, I could have never imagined I'd be so popular. A basic contention of this presentation is that Catholic educators in the age of AI ought to distance Catholic education from liberal education, or at least to be explicit about how a Catholic education radically redefines the adjective liberal. Unfortunately, liberal education is a fundamentally ambiguous phrase, as I found out in my research, admitting definition only in relation to a select set of terms in the context of this paper, especially the term critical thinking. Generally, then, liberal education means education of the whole person through the cultivation of critical thinking, to the end of allowing persons to develop a discerning freedom adequate to the challenges presented by the varying circumstances of their lives and indeed the world. In this way, a liberal education prides itself in being neither parochial nor technical. Its goal is the development of the uomo universale, the universal human. But, as Bernard Lonergan has pointed out, the universality of this conception of education is grounded in the presupposition of a classicist notion of culture. What does he mean by that? Rather than approaching culture empirically, that is descriptively, the classicist notion of culture is normative. On this view, critical thinking and discerning freedom develop in the individual who engages with classics. Of course, though the classic is defined by the norms of a specific culture, it is generally concerned to be of universal import. Even if pluralism is acknowledged, in fact, it is not integrated into educational norms in any thoroughgoing fashion as evidence. Witness how culturally responsive pedagogy, those of you who have taught high school as I have know what that is, has to a great extent only succeeded in approaching cultural diversity as one might approach museum pieces, with deference, no doubt, but only from a distance because not the core of curriculum. Now, I'm not out to deny the existence of genuine classics, nor do I want to suggest that engagement with classics bears no significance. The point that I am in fact making must be split in two with only one half apposite to the 18 minutes I've been allotted. Let me begin with what I will not explore here except through the following cursory remarks. Maybe we can explore this more in the Q&A. The normative must surely play a central role in our understanding of education, but where is the normative to be found? Most would point to the nature of human intelligence to answer this question, as for instance in the notion of critical thinking. However, the nature of human intelligence is a thorny issue to take up in a context that lies in the shadow of modern epistemology. If we are to reject the move from pluralism to relativism, then we must identify a verifiable definition of intelligence that is capacious enough to accommodate intelligence in all its culturally diverse modal instantiations. If you hear Bernard Lonergan in the background there, you're correct. Most importantly, in the present moment, I believe that the Catholic tradition possesses the resources for accomplishing this task and, consequently, for not capitulating to the hegemony of the technocratic understanding of intelligence implicit in AI. But this talk is not about that. Instead, this talk is about how Catholic education might constitute a genuinely ecological education, to use Pope Francis's phrase, and thus might address the alienation of a liquid world in the age of AI, to use another Pope Francis phrase from Dilexit Nos. The above discussion is meant to allow me to introduce a problematization of the classicist universalization of both critical thinking and freedom within liberal education as it is generally understood. It is common knowledge now that AI is not some ethereal phenomenon, but a material technology with material consequences. Data centers consume electricity and water at exorbitant rates. We know this, even if Sam Altman wants to undercut those rates. Yet it seems clear that liberal education, as it is generally understood, is capable of forming persons who can provide at least technically creative solutions to these problems. However, I would argue that this sort of solution is what Pope Francis warned us of as, quote, merely technical solutions that address symptoms but not underlying problems. The classicist emphasis on universalized notions of critical thinking and freedom that abstract from specific ecologies cannot provide structural solutions to ecological crisis because such an emphasis is complicit in the structural sin at the very basis of that crisis. In turn, this same emphasis is complicit in what Pope Francis describes as the individualistic fragmentation endemic to a liquid world defined by rapidification. Fragmentation and crisis are here structurally coupled. Taking our cue from Pope Francis's Querida Amazonia, we name this structural sin uprootedness. Finally, following Laudato Si's recognition that technology is not neutral, we will argue that AI is defined by a propensity to exacerbate this structural uprootedness. For our purposes, AI does so specifically as it is implemented in education for the sake of assisting students in a personalized journey toward the development of their critical thinking. In other words, AI exacerbates uprootedness to the extent that it is deployed as a democratizing force in education. To substantiate these claims, I must show how the classicist universalization of critical thinking as foundational to liberal education generally understood is complicit in uprootedness, and correlatively, I must show how a genuinely ecological education is not commensurate with that understanding of liberal education. In Querida Amazonia, Pope Francis defined rootedness in relation to the notion of buen vivir, translated good living. While good living is not a bad translation, according to Uruguayan environmental scientist Eduardo Gudinas, buen vivir more fully denotes the irreducible entanglement of individual and communal flourishing with the notion of community dilated to include the non-human. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis's discussion of buen vivir involves the recognition that an understanding of quality of life should not be imposed on a people from outside their own culture. Such an imposition is a technique of colonization. Indeed, Pope Francis explicitly notes that quality of life as understood within many indigenous communities is connected to land. For this reason, environmental justice is intrinsically related to social justice. Quality of life, in this sense, can only be realized when there is a diversity of human cultures that integrate their living diversely with the diverse ecosystems on our planet. Thus did Pope Francis understand the leveling effect of the technocratic paradigm to be so pernicious. While human cultures possess intrinsic value, genuine cultural diversity, that is, not the above-mentioned valuation of diversity that surveys cultures as mere museum pieces, as in the case of politics of recognition or identity, that cultural diversity is a necessary condition for addressing ecological crisis. To explicate this last point, we must turn to scholarship on indigeneity. According to Potawatomi environmental scientist Kyle Powys-White, indigeneity is not reducible to autochthony in any simple sense, because indigenous originality entails not merely coming before, but an identification with, participation in, and responsibility to the dynamic network of diverse agencies and reciprocal relationships constituting a specific ecology. According to White, then, indigenous knowledge is more than collected observations maintained and passed down intergenerationally. Rather, it is more fully participatory. For this reason, Potawatomi environmental scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer considers the dictum, quote, take only that which is given, to be essential to what she names the honorable harvest, quote, the indigenous canon of practices and principles that govern the exchange of life for life. When I teach my course on theology and environmental justice, I'm at pains to point out to my students that this is no quaint or simplistically romantic dictum. Anyone who has foraged for multiple seasons knows that knowledge of the natures and life cycles of flora requires immense time, patience, care, attentiveness, and embodied engagement. This is even more so the case when one understands foraging to be a form of tending by which the flourishing of flora is promoted. To discern what is given within an ecosystem, one's life must be embedded within that ecosystem, must be isomorphic with the structural dynamics of that ecosystem. Otherwise, one's living will not consist of a reciprocity that is ecologically implanted, and so one's unilateral activities will exhaust the ecosystem by which one lives. Because humans are de facto cultural, this means that people will live the honorable harvest to the extent that their culture's practices invite conscious and concrete participation in and not abstraction from local ecosystems. Thus, scholar of education Cynthia Chambers insists that a curriculum of place, perhaps we could say land, must be a matter of enskillment. That is, a matter of a bodily engaged apprenticeship to skilled practices that are embedded within specific ecologies, that educate attention as acts of ongoing monitoring and prudent adjustment irreducible to rules, and that are storied, and so rooted mnemonically in deep time, intergenerational mutual responsibility, and the sacred. Notice that indigenous knowledge, and so indigenous education, is in a very important sense rooted. Matisse environmental scholar Max Liboiron makes this point by distinguishing lowercase l land from uppercase L land. Lowercase l land is a resource, an empty container, a blank there in which anything can take place insofar as it abstracts from concrete relationality. Uppercase L land is for Liboiron a verb, a living history, a quote, managed, interconnected tapestry of reciprocity. In this sense, Liboiron contends that uppercase L land is, quote, specific and unique, not universal and common. Thus, pulling some threads together here, buen vivir, the flourishing of a community constituted by a web of differentiated agencies and responsibilities among humans and non-humans, is rooted, and so not universal and common. If an ecological education must reject colonial structures, then, to use Pope Francis's words, it is meant, quote, to cultivate without uprooting, to foster growth without weakening identity, to be supportive without being invasive. This task is incommensurate with an education whose central goal is the cultivation of the whole person in the sense of the cultivation of the classicist notion of the uomo universale, the universal human. Critical thinking, as envisioned within liberal education generally understood, abstracts from practices that are embedded in specific ecologies, and is therefore at least implicitly complicit in the relegation of indigenous knowledge to outside the domain of normatively legitimate knowledge production and transmission. Pope Francis apologized for the forced assimilation definitive of the residential school system, even going so far in an interview as to acknowledge that it was an instance of genocide. I invite us to reflect on another related pattern of forceful assimilation, perhaps implicit, that is the consequence of the structural sin of uprootedness, as such uprootedness is presupposed in common conceptions of education today. Education generally continues in this way to be structurally colonial. To move one step further in the argument, the uprootedness structuring education is a core component of what in Dilexit Nos Pope Francis calls our liquid world. In Querida Amazonia, Pope Francis points out that colonialism and its ecological effects have caused indigenous peoples to, quote, lack the points of reference and the cultural roots that provide them with an identity and a sense of dignity because it disrupts the cultural transmission of a wisdom that has been passed down for centuries from generation to generation. Dispossession is ongoing in the sense that capital L land is quite difficult to practice, structurally speaking. Land as a verb is lost when education no longer involves apprenticeship leading to enskillment embedded within specific ecologies. In this sense, contemporary education is predominantly uprooting. While the injustices suffered by indigenous communities within colonialism are unique, it's important to emphasize, I would argue that this progressive uprootedness is an essential and thus generally structural feature of colonialism even today. With cultural rootedness largely consigned to oblivion, the dominant resources available today for constructing an identity are those of expressive individualism, the relativistic consumerism against which Pope Francis so ardently railed. The self on this conception is a tabula rasa tied essentially to nowhere, liquid because intrinsically shapeless. We lack symbols and substantive ends, cultural resources with which to identify ourselves. What does this have to do with AI? Thanks for your patience. In an address to the G7 session on AI in 2024, Pope Francis framed AI as an instantiation of the technocratic paradigm insofar as, according to its, quote, fundamental design, it might limit our worldview to realities expressible in numbers and enclosed in predetermined categories, thereby excluding the contribution of other forms of truth and imposing uniform anthropological, socioeconomic, and cultural models, end quote. That is, AI might exacerbate the above-mentioned homogenizing effect of technocracy because it absolutizes a single culturally relative understanding of intelligence and its socio-political effects. In Dilexit Nos, Pope Francis comments that no algorithm can capture the feeling of remembering our first experience of culinary apprenticeship with family members. As much research has shown, AI promotes various forms of de-skilling. This is by design, insofar as, to draw on Albert Borgman, devices conceal toilsome means for the sake of rendering ends commodities because instantaneously available. I believe that this is partly what Pope Francis had in mind when he argued that AI might detract from apprenticeship. That is, it fosters anonymity because the concealment of means entails a relationality as a structuring feature of consciousness in a liquid world. In these ways, then, AI is defined by a propensity to further delegitimize indigenous or traditional knowledge by the further consolidation of structural uprootedness. But this is not all. Forced assimilation within education has been historically enacted through surveillance, standardization, and classification, the distinction of students into different groups, honor students, non-honor students. It goes without saying at this point that AI is a surveillance technology. Just think of all the debates surrounding AI and the right to privacy. However, standardization is also a contemporary technique of both surveillance and classification and is historically rooted in eugenics. The SAT was developed by eugenicist Carl Brigham. The implementation of AI and standardized testing compounds this, see Texas, insofar as some of the basic statistical algorithms comprising machine learning were developed by eugenicists in part to provide a purportedly objective basis for their views on race. Now, do not misunderstand me. I am not arguing that these statistical algorithms are therefore intrinsically racist in every application. Instead, I am inquiring into the structural potentialities of the application of AI in education. This is a structural analysis. Racial inequity is already a structural sin defining our education system. AI has the potential to exacerbate this if applied to the task of standardization. Moreover, as education writer Audrey Waters notes, standardization is paradoxically at the heart of the history of the machine-affected personalization of education. In this way, by being touted as a force for the democratization of education, AI might perpetuate the leveling of what is taken as legitimate knowledge, and in so doing exacerbate structural uprootedness. Again, as abstracting from specific ecologies in its universalizing orientation, standardization as a centrally structuring feature of education is incommensurate with the pluralism inherent to the notion, I would say the diversity inherent to the notion of bon vivre. Let me end with 3 quick addenda. First, there is much good about liberal education. Don't get me wrong. I teach philosophy and theology at Mount St. Mary's University, touching on the classics from Plato to Kant. And this is extraordinarily significant in the lives of my students. Knowledge production that abstracts from embeddedness in particular ecologies is not intrinsically evil. Again, this is structural analysis. It is my hope that this presentation, I only pick on liberal education because its correlative notions of critical thinking and freedom play a fundamental role in the structural uprootedness of our education system generally. It is my hope that this presentation inspires others to join me in thinking through how we might make liberal education and all that's good about it ecological through making it rooted. This would require thinking through how rootedness is at the heart of genuine liberty. Second, there is much good that AI can concretely do. Cancer research, protein folding, climate modeling. Okay. My argument is primarily a matter of structural analysis and only secondarily a matter of particular use. 3 sentences. Third, the question of how to make education structurally rooted is directly related to questions regarding enculturation in the church. I'm a theologian. We must not understand enculturation as mere ornamentation added to a core. Enculturation is genuinely revelatory. It is the locus where meet nova et vetera on multiple levels. May we have the courage to recognize this as we approach the challenges that AI presents to the task of educating toward ecological consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for those papers. And so now we have plenty of time for questions. So, started? Yes, so there should be a microphone coming around.
Thank you all so much for your presentations. This is a question primarily directed to Drs. Kim and Nutter. So as I was listening to your presentations, I kept thinking about the ungrading movement that's going on right now. And I wondered if you could chat a little bit about this. Let me say why. I teach in a great books program. I teach philosophy and theology. And I've got some very bright students who are really taking to the material. So I've invited them, hey, think about minoring or majoring. And they say, yeah, I would, but this material is a lot tougher than my other things, and I need to get into med school, and I need to get into law school. So I just think maybe I won't take any more philosophy after this. I really like it, but my parents have been really clear with me, right? This is about getting a job. I keep thinking, well, things would be quite different if we weren't giving you grades in this class. So it seems like we have these goals to move education beyond this instrumentalist good, and we keep packaging it into an instrumentalist package. It seems like what we do speaks against what we say, and this leads to the standardization that Dr. Nutter is talking about too, by ranking students in these sorts of ways and making their future dependent on how well they understood Kant on this test. And so I just wonder if you have thoughts about that. It seems like your proposals would require something much more radical to our system than just kind of saying, hey, don't think about education as a means or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I do implement ungrading practices in my own teaching, but at the same time, I have to recognize that the ideals of ungrading are only to be approached asymptotically. I taught at a high school, a Cristo Rey High School in Richmond, Virginia, and there were many questions about how to allow students to bring the affordances of their own culture to what they are being taught in their school. If, for instance, I taught composition courses then, I teach composition courses now. If I were not to teach standard English in my composition courses, I would be doing an incredible disservice to the students in a world in which they're already structurally disadvantaged, speaking to the Cristo Rey School in particular. So it's a responsibility, in fact, to teach normative English in composition, even if my students are coming to my classroom with speaking diverse Englishes, bringing many different grammars. And so ungrading provides a way to balance in a context like that. How do I enable students to inhabit their specific ecologies, whatever that may look like, while also living in a world structurally defined by capitalism such that if we don't, in some sense, instrumentalize education for our students, in some sense, then we're doing them a disservice because we're not giving them the tools to enter into the structures as they are of their society. But we should also give them the skills to be able to critically analyze it. That's a really difficult balance, but I do believe ungrading is a part of it.
Yeah, I was trying to think about something helpful to say here. I mean, I'm not sure because we already exist within this structure, and the students need certain kinds of grades to then go to med school if they want to, and they should be able to if they are seeking that, or law school. Yeah, but certainly the grading and those standards do promote instrumentalized mindset. Like it happened actually in China too, and Korea and Japan. Actually, the civil service examination was on Confucian classical texts. And so in the beginning, I think people had maybe the healthy mindset of like, oh, I'm going to become a learned person by studying these Confucian texts. But actually what happened over time was it was a mode by which you can step up and gain this prestigious position. And I remember in Korea, like there were I remember watching these Korean dramas where like it would show this, like some kid would study so hard and then do the best in the civil service examination, and then they would be carried on this beautiful, luxurious carriage back home, and then the villagers would cheer them, and he would honor his parents, And I was very, but I think that probably instilled in me also kind of an instrumentalizing kind of mindset. You do this because then you also please your parents, or then you gain a good position. So I don't think that's healthy. But on the other, so I don't know. That mixture is like we're human beings. We have this kind of psychology where we are seeking something for the sake of another, and we do want external goods. And in and of itself, that's not bad, right? But the hope is that somehow they will come to love it, right? That is the real hope. But I don't even know how that really happens. Why does that happen to some people and sometimes don't to some students? I don't know what's going on. I don't have a good explanation. Sorry, that's not really a helpful resolution, but I don't have that much. I don't know what to say.
Questions? Hi. Can you wait for the microphone? Yeah.
Sure. Hi. I love thinking about structural sin and accreditation. because we have this illusion of freedom as educators that we can do as we please, and then we have to report to the accreditors, and it turns out that a very small number of identical organizations are controlling all of K through graduate education in the country, and they don't know why we're alive, and yet we put ourselves in their hands. So I'm wondering, in the age of the algorithm, what new institutions need to form? In every era when we have disruption, we end up with the Jesuits, or we end up with an abbey, or we end up with a democracy. What institutions do you foresee or wish we would see arising in the age of AI?
That was a question to everyone, right? Yeah, Heather.
Thanks for that. So thank you for the question. I think we both were in the same panel, the Lonergan panel last, right? So former high school teacher to high school teacher, thank you for the question. By means of background, I've been through accreditation in 3 different countries, all of which horrible. In the UK, it's primarily administered by the government, not so great, and then here, all sorts. It was very hard. I'm also an AP teacher, so you know what I mean, right? It's very hard, beginning even with inquiry, right? For those of you that don't know or haven't heard about the AP system in a while, right? I taught at a Catholic school when I was still a high school teacher. We had 180 days to deliver the AP curriculum. I lived on the East Coast. I learned about nor'easters in the United States. Those are a thing. So we never had those 180 days. And we had to program in inquiry, right? Because I had a system that valued the kind of instrumentalization of learning that my 2 colleagues are talking about. We were even accredited by a system that was Catholic, right? And so for me, if I can add one piece with the hope, because we all finished on hope, right? That my colleagues will add their own pieces to give you this beautiful vision of an institution. The first one that I would like to see is, as a part of the accreditation process, and hand on heart, I've only been through it twice in the United States through the same authority, an understanding of the subject area, yes, but in relation to this larger whole. That's integrative action, to me, is incredibly important for education, right? All the time, but especially now when students can so easily search for and get real information, and sometimes fake information, right? Real information about a thing totally apart from its context. So for me, if we can kind of build up a vision for what you're asking for, a part of the accreditation process should be some kind of examination or conversation about the kind of integrated nature of the education being delivered by that school. So that's my first piece.
I think actually in the age of AI, the best thing would be really good Catholic universities. Mm-hmm. Because we have theology, if it's going well, theology which kind of organizes, right? Why are you laughing? It's true. Right, and philosophy, we're the handmaid of theology. My wife is a theologian, so I serve her. Okay, and then yeah, but if you got these organizing principles or inquiry that structures. I mean, it's not everyone loves talking about interdisciplinary, inquiry, but you want to structure those disciplines, and you want a kind of a culminating kind of wisdom. And so I think the Catholic tradition. I don't know. Maybe I just. Maybe because I'm Catholic, but it just seems so right to me to have those. And McIntyre talks about this in God, Philosophy, and University with the important why theology and philosophy, for these reasons, are so important because they integrate the different domains of study. So I think that's actually really important.
That's a wonderful question. It's really had me stumped for the last few minutes. I'm not sure I do hope in institutions. But that's not to say that I want institutions to be abolished or anything like that. I'm not I'm not hoping that we'll all start the proletariat revolution right here. But I guess I do hope in something like the parish, if we're going to actually have our lives embedded in specific ecologies, then we need to dilate our notion of family to involve kinship networks beyond nuclear family that are rooted in mutual aid such that we don't have to be dependent upon the accoutrements of structural injustice to a greater and greater extent. And people in parishes are already doing this to a large extent. But again, that's not therefore saying there's no worth to institutions. That's not where my thought goes generally to what the institutions would look like. I do believe that for those of us who are seeking the kingdom, we can do so very well in institutions, but usually that's a weird mixture of with and against the institutions. So that's why I don't know if I hope in the institutions per se.
Thank you for the talks. My question is about, Richard, you were talking about how, AI doesn't really affect true education if we consider like the classical view of education. But I'm wondering if, since we already live in a world of algorithms, and I think most of the time that's bad for us. But at the same time, if we have, a lot of us in this room might have algorithms where, the stuff in the algorithm actually isn't that bad a lot of the time. Like, we're watching like Bishop Barron videos that pop up or dancing Dominican friars or something like that. Could we?
I don't know if you're the normal average.
I'm not talking about myself, guys. Could there be like a scaffolding that you could build of AI algorithms or like an AI structure that can, reward virtue and not punish, but discourage vice or something like that? Or do we want to just scrap it altogether and avoid it?
Yeah, we're not scrapping it. It's like $40 billion. 40% of stock market is in it. It's not going anywhere. But so we can't really scrap it. Yeah, what can you do? I don't know. What answer can I? What am I going to say right here? It's always like for me, like you should build that scaffolding for yourself and maybe your friends. Show them the way, or if you have children or nieces and so the localism. You can only do that much, and then I think there's this ultimate being God that has more power and all. So I think there's good reason for hope also, because I think sometimes people talk about that Terminator scenario, the Skynet thing, and I'm like, I don't know, I think Jesus might come back before that. Okay, and I don't think that's gonna happen, because right? No, but if you're like my atheist friends, I don't know what that's pretty dark. Because if that really, but I think God exists. He's not gonna let that happen. So I have hope like that. But you can work at the local level, yeah.
Time for one more question.
Okay, my name is John Zimmer. I'm going to press it on that last question. As teachers, mentors, parents, how do we help? I'm thinking specifically Gen Z that is growing up with AI as part of their education, even if the educators don't want it to be. So they're coming into the workplaces, they're coming into their careers, utilizing AI to do their thinking for them, rather than utilizing AI to help them think or help them process. So I'm wondering what we can do very pragmatically. I think of this like, for example, with cell phones. The common response to a cell phone, for those who understand its debilitating nature, is, well, just put locks on it and make it so you can't. Well, you know what? You're going to use a cell phone. How do you develop the virtue, the character to utilize it in the right way? And I would say the same thing about AI. How do we face the reality of it and help our young people utilize it properly, rather than just saying, no AI, because that's not going to happen.
To draw on my talk, first, thank you so much for that question. To draw on a concept from my talk, we invite students to a great extent to the norms definitive of enskillment. I think about what Pope Francis says in Dilexit Nos about culinary apprenticeship. I know that sounds quaint, but it's very serious. I think of the way in which, growing up, for instance, my mother would tend to prickly pear cactus and then use that to make nopalitos. And she would teach me how to do this, right? And it's both harvesting, knowing how to tend to the plants, knowing how to cut it up, so on and so forth. Now, what in the world does that have to do with your question in terms of using AI well? If AI were around at that time when I was being taught those concrete skills in an embodied fashion through apprenticeship to my mother, I wouldn't have had any use to AI. And that apprenticeship is also the cultivation of a set of virtues that forms the mind such that you recognize good, in which case technologies are useful, in which case not. And I would hope that we can really go whole hog with this sooner rather than later. You know, when I teach a course on artificial intelligence in the Catholic social teaching tradition, and I point out to my students that in the United States, it could have been the case that, you know, communities as a whole shared one vehicle such that each family used it once a year. But instead, structurally, our society is now shaped around the car such that you can't get anywhere without it. So the more that we can envelop our students in an environment that is defined by enskillment, and that is those practices for which artificial intelligence is not really useful, and the virtues that attend it, the greater their capacity to recognize creative non-use in their lives, and so to form a society that it is the corollary of that creative non-use.
You want to start? Okay, cool. John, thank you for the question. It's too bad they left, I think because of, it was lunchtime for them, but my children are actually sat at the back of the room. They're not here. Okay, cool. They're not here anymore. So I wanted to take your question in two levels, acknowledging the fact that if we don't educate for the reality as we understand it right now, where X% and someone can like shout out what it is that the jobs in 5 to 10 years will require some degree of knowledge of the thing that AI is, I would argue we start to brush up against failing in our role as teachers and parents. And to touch on two pieces, because you asked about practical pieces. For K through 12, and I speak as a parent and former teacher, I think taking seriously what the use of the thing should be is incredibly important. And to concretize this, as parents, we are making the choice to send our children to a school where technology is invited into the classroom experience when it is necessary, as opposed to, and again, this is a personal decision, as opposed to it kind of following the students around at every opportunity, right? And we're cultivating the kind of virtue, in a sense, of prudence where technology is concerned, right? It's not going to be a pick up a phone all the time. Sometimes they'll, we're kind of modeling for them, right? That it is both possible phone and text and conversation with a 3D human being. And I wanted to kind of jump in with respect to the university setting, and I'm not saying that this is not also applicable to high school and K through 8, but through a university setting, I wanted to jump in on the earlier question, or the first question posed about ungrading, or second question. And that I think we need to take seriously to kind of support students as they kind of learn to navigate this world of AI. We need to take seriously how we assess, right? And whether that's ungrading or whether it is some other modality of assessment. I think we have an opportunity here, right? To really think about how we can assess students for the goods that my colleagues have mentioned, but also in the world in which you are very clearly naming. So for me, that looks very similar to my colleagues, but we can definitely talk about that after, because I know I'm like up against the time. Richard? Awesome.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for those questions.